So in the last segment, we learned some basic terms: proposition, belief, justification, truth, falsity. If you haven't seen that, go back and watch it, because I'm going to assume that you already are sort of a master of that vocabulary. Now we're going to start talking about what arguments are. So what are the elements of arguments? An argument includes a conclusion and premises. The conclusion is what you're trying to establish. It's what you're trying to demonstrate. You're not taking it for granted. You're not assuming it's right. You're trying to show that it's right. Premises, by contrast, are that which you sort of take for granted, at least for the time being. You might end up providing a premise for an argument later, but you might end up providing an argument for a premise later, but in the current conversational context or reasoning context, you say, for now, I'm taking this for granted. That's a premise. And a premise is just a proposition that provides partial evidence for a conclusion. So in order for a proposition to be a premise, requires two things. One is that you're taking it for granted, at least for now, and the other is that you're using it to try and establish something else, to try and show that something else is true, and that something else is your conclusion. There's also one further element in an argument, which is the implication relationship. Implication is a relationship between the premises and the conclusion. So the premise or premises that comprise the conclusion, the premise or premises together imply the conclusion if the argument's good, and they fail to imply the conclusion if the argument's bad. Here's an example of an argument. This argument comes from a little video, which if you click on the link up here, you can watch the video before you see this. It's a Monty Python sketch in which they give a really nice definition of what an argument is, and they contrast it with various ways in which people use the word argument that aren't relevant for our class, like yelling at each other doesn't count as an argument. Disagreement doesn't count as an argument. What you need for an argument is someone using premises to try and establish a conclusion where the premises are supposed to imply the conclusion. So here's an argument. If that was 5 minutes, then you wouldn't be arguing. That's a premise. You are arguing. That's another premise. Therefore, that wasn't 5 minutes. That's a conclusion. And the person is trying to say that this first premise, if that was 5 minutes, you wouldn't be arguing, and the second premise, you are arguing, together imply this conclusion. That wasn't 5 minutes. Now, there's a couple of things I want you to notice about this. We're introducing here a way of representing arguments, a way of representing reasoning that's going to be a central part of the class. So each premise is numbered. So we have a number 1 for this premise, we have a number 2 for this premise, and each conclusion is numbered. Here there's just one conclusion, and it's numbered 3. And then we identify the premises as premises by writing premise, or you can just write a letter P. And we identify the conclusion as a conclusion by writing conclusion, or you could just write the letter C. And now comes something crucial. In addition to writing that it's a conclusion, we write which premises it came from. That way, if we had a list of, say, 30 premises and 6 conclusions, we could just say this conclusion comes from numbers 7, 8, and 9. This one comes from numbers 3 and 4, and so on and so forth. Okay? In this case, the conclusion number 3 comes from the only two premises that they are, 1 and 2. And of course, you need both of these premises to get to this conclusion. You should always include here only that which is required to get to the conclusion. Okay. Again, these things here are the premises, that's the conclusion, and this here is the relation of implication. We say together 1 and 2 imply 3. Now, this is just a bit of vocabulary here. Sometimes people use the word infer in this context. Inference is something a person does. So a person, someone, infers 3 from 1 and 2. Implication is a relationship between the propositions themselves. It's not something a person does. When you say that someone implies something, you mean something very different than what we mean when we're talking about implication in this context. In this context, when we talk about implication, it's a relationship between the propositions themselves. So if we say 1 and 2, we can say 1 and 2 imply 3. We wouldn't say 1 and 2 infer 3 because inference is something a person does. Okay. So the conclusion is what we aim to establish. The premise is our evidence or reasons for that conclusion, and the implication is the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. We'll stop there because the next segment will be a bit longer. In the next segment, what we're going to do is we're going to look at 3 kinds of arguments, abductive, inductive, and deductive, and we'll talk about what each of those kinds of arguments is. That is how each of those kinds of arguments works.